Yeah, I had a question about exercising on Shabbat.
Yeah, what's the question? If it's allowed?
Uh, yeah, like let's say I do jujitsu regularly. Is it
All right.
if I'm
No,
able to
so
walk?
I do jujitsu. In Israel, we did it. It was called free fight. But here, I go to top team. All right. So, can you do BJJ on Shabbat? I have a video called "Can You Run on Shabbat?" Someone once asked me a question: if they enjoyed running on Shabbat, what's the issue? So I researched it in terms of at least running, and I took into account things like Uvdin, the whole weekday activity, which really doesn't apply to this. And the outcome was that as long as it wasn't done for medicinal reasons, right? Because the doctor told you to do it, but you were doing it as an oneg, as something that you delighted in on Shabbat, there would be no issue in exerting yourself to that point. So I'm trying to think what would be the prohibition between that and doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I have a video that I bring down the sources. If you go on YouTube and just type in running on Shabbat, because I also run marathons and stuff. So someone asked me to look up if you could run a marathon on Shabbat. All the sources I found that we consider like an onik for you, like something you do that's pleasurable, is allowed. But if it's done something that a doctor told you to do, like these little stretches, then it's not allowed. So I would say that jiu-jitsu is fully allowed. So just ride a bike there. Don't drive.
Okay.
That's another thing. I mean, the average rider would say that riding a bike is not allowed. Now, that's something to roll with, the notion of riding a bike on Shabbat, especially to go to shul. Friends, do you know how many problems that would solve? Think about it. If people would just allow riding a bike on Shabbat. Now, there's many people in my community who ride scooters on Shabbat because they have a special heter from their rabbi, allowing them to push a scooter. I'm not talking about the Shabbos Amigo ones. I mean, just like a regular scooter that a kid would use. People give heterim to use these on Shabbat. I mean, why shouldn't they? As a matter of fact, why should you need a heter? But more importantly, what's the issue with riding a bike on Shabbat? If the huge Chilul Hashem nowadays is people driving on Shabbat, especially to places like conservative and reform synagogues, why not offer them the option of riding a bicycle on Shabbat? I really don't know why. Now, if someone needs a source on why they could ride their bike on Shabbat, the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai writes that it is permissible to ride a bike on Shabbat. And this even extends outside of an Eruv. Now, outside of an Eruv, it seems that his ruling is more secondary in the sense that if it's done for a mitzvah, fine. That just means that it wasn't prohibited to begin with. And here, he also says that it's not or doesn't fall under the category of uvdin dechol, of things that are done during the week, but should be accepted as an oneg Shabbat, as something that you do because you like doing it. And if it's in the case of going to the Beit HaKnesset, then it's something that you almost must do, in some way running to do a mitzvah, instead of just walking. But even after he came out with his ruling, like many rabbis do, they started spreading rumors that saying, oh, well, he changed his mind afterwards because he realized he was wrong. This was done by the Yaskil Avdi. But even Rabbi Avadi Yosef said that this was a false rumor. That even when the Ben Ish Chai was older, he confirmed the ruling that one could ride a bike on Shabbat. Now, nowadays, the understanding is that because the chain might fall off. Now, clearly, there weren't any bikes in the times of Chazal, in Talmudic times when there was a Sanhedrin, so clearly no one could say that it's actually prohibited. But the understanding is that what classification could it actually be violating? Now, more likely than not, chains do not fall off of at least new bicycles in the normal or regular way that one would use a bicycle. So even on that understanding that it's less than 50% chance that you'd come to do work, it would also be allowed. But if not, for sure, these scooters with big wheels, these scooters are not necessarily the ones that kids use, but they have a bigger wheel and they get you to shul quicker. In other words, if the goal really was combating people doing melacha on Shabbat, then why don't they allow this? No, that's not the issue. The issue is a competition amongst the rabbis on who could be more primitive. They ultimately don't care about the Jewish people, because if they cared about the Jewish people, they would facilitate them coming to shul more, learning more Torah on Shabbat, especially in places where the walk alone is the biggest deterrent to coming to shul. Not to mention that it might even make you a target in many cases, because at least on a bike, you can flee quicker being that most Jewish neighborhoods, at least large Jewish communities in America, are located in dangerous areas. Most people are not trying to chase people down on bicycles. But anyways, because nowadays no one takes you serious unless you can quote from an actual posek, quote from the Ben Ishai. That you don't have to be Sephardi to quote from him, to say that I hold like this because of him. Again, we don't need a posek in this area because anyone with a basic understanding of halakha knows it is not violating anything brought down by Chazal. And notions like fixing a chain, it does not resemble what the Achronim said it resembled, which is the prohibition of tuning instruments on Shabbat that Chazal do mention. Because clearly a chain on a bicycle today is not as likely to break or fall off the sprocket as a string was likely to break 2,000 years ago. But anyways, but there's technically nothing wrong with riding a bike on Shabbat. So the Ben Ishai was he was the guy who predated Rav Ovadia Yosef, like the head of the Sephardi community in Baghdad. But if you had to hold by someone, say the Ben Ishai says you can ride a bike on Shabbos.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
It
All
would
right,
make
man.
sense if they could ride a bike on Shabbos. I mean, you got all these
Do you know how easy it would be?
Shape.
Here,
Huh? Go ahead.
I'm dominating now. So you know how easy it would be to go to shul, like on a bike, especially in South Florida. Like my shul, I started going to this new shul. There's like a breakaway shul that just opened up
Rabbi,
all the way at the end of it.
Conservative people that drive going on a bike, then
but
you
that's
would get
different.
some people loving it.
Well, conservative people aren't from. Driving is the least of what they do wrong. But in terms of people who try to be observant, but the shul that I'm going to now is probably like 3 miles away in South Florida heat. Now, there's a shul closer to me, but these guys are trying to make a minyan in the house, and it takes me about an hour to get there walking. Right? It's so hot here. I mean, on a bike, just think about it. That you can have your own little Shabbos bike. Like, it's not something that's chol. It's not something that you use during the week. It's like a special Shabbat bike, and then it'd be so nice. And just think about it. In front of a shul, there'll just be like all these parking spots for bikes, and then people will be like lowrider bikes, 2-seater bikes, and people popping wheelies in the parking lot. You see, knock the Torah score over, and chillin' all over the floor, juice, and this like Jewish guy falls, and there's like all these like rugula that falls out of his pocket, and they're like, "You stole the rugula," and then it's like chaos. There is in my community, there's this guy who rides a bike to shul, and then he pulls his kids in the back in one of those little like those little covered things where it's so cool. I guess this guy doesn't even care. If somebody born Jewish could pull it off, but a convert, forget about it. You're going to get an email. Please cease and desist from attending our synagogue in your bike. But anyways,